So as we start the series, God is Enough, I also want to talk about what's been going on in our society, our culture, and our world. It's just, it's really distressing. And I'm going to go ahead and mention some of the things. So on one hand, we have some African Americans that have been murdered by police officers, and that's very distressing. And I do think there is some systemic prejudice still and oppression in our society. It's just the reality. You know, then we have protesters, understandably wanting us to pay attention to this. Then we have rioters that I don't approve of that are out taking advantage of the situation and being as bad as the people that murdered somebody. And as a result of some of the riots, there's even been innocent police officers that have been murdered. And that's unacceptable. So there's just a lot of turmoil in our society. And then we have the virus, and we have unemployment, and we have people that have lost their jobs, and they're really worried about it. And, you know, it's almost like we're just sort of living in a fog. And living in a fog makes it hard to see where you're going and what you're going to do. And what, Mike, what is this?
Well, earlier in the week you said, you know, you were trying to get ready for the lesson. You're a little bit of a so I thought
All right, well, thanks. You know, do you ever feel like you're living in a fog, honestly? I do. Some of you I know have struggled figuring out how you're going to pay your bills, right? Worried about how you're going to pay your rent. Some of you are in high-risk jobs and you're worried that you might catch the virus and there's not anything you can do about it. Some of you are concerned that your life just isn't turning out the way you planned for it to turn out, and that maybe some of your dreams are never going to come true. Some of you are in relationships that are strained, and it's breaking your heart because it's not what you wanted, and you're losing hope. I know that some of you feel like you're being treated unfairly, or things that are rightfully yours are being taken away from you. And you feel like somehow your life is just letting you down. And when that happens, we're concerned about whether or not we're going to have a purposeful life, or whether or not our life is going to have meaning. And things become sort of foggy in our life, and it's hard to see where to go and how to get there. And when things are foggy in our life, it brings dangers into our life because we have to decide how to deal with the fog. So in Psalm 23, and I want to read this to you, David, who went through his share of fog in his life, says this: "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Basically, David says, in spite of the ups and downs of my life, in spite of sometimes feeling like I'm living in a fog, God is still enough to meet my needs. And what happens as we go through life, I really believe we become fearful that we aren't going to get what we need in our life to be happy and to be content. That's what we're afraid of. And when we have those fears, one of the things that it leads to is worry. Do you ever feel like this guy? You know, all these things going on in your head at the same time, and you're wondering, how am I possibly going to get everything done? I keep lists upon list upon list. It's part of the way I manage my anxiety. And if I can stay on my schedule, I can control my anxiety. But when I get off schedule, I get anxious because I want to try and control my life and make sure that my needs are met. And I start worrying. Now, did you know that about 30% of our worries, research shows, are worries due to things that have already happened and aren't likely to happen again? And we worry about something that already happened. 52% of our worries, research shows, will probably never happen. Never. 12% of those are health worries we have that will probably never happen, but we're going to worry about them. Only 8% of the things we worry about are things that actually legitimately are something we should be concerned about. Only 8%. And of those, only 2% of the worries actually ever turn out to be anything what we thought they might be, which means we spend a lot of time worrying for nothing. Why do we worry? Well, this quote here by Eckhart Tolle is, worry pretends to be necessary but serves no useful purpose. Now here's why we worry. We worry, if we're honest about it, and research shows people worry because they think it's actually an effective coping mechanism. We worry because we think that if we worry about something, it will get better. Or if we worry about something, it will cause us to find a solution. But one of the other reasons that we worry is because we feel like we are the ones that are in charge. We are the ones that will have to step up to meet our own needs and solve our own problems. And so we worry because we are the ones that want to go and fix our life and make sure that we get what we need in our life. But that's not the strategy that David used. In Psalm 23, verse 1, and this is what we're going to focus on today, David says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want." Now, if the Lord is my shepherd, what does that make you? Sheep. Now, here's the thing about sheep. Sheep are not the most intelligent animal that God ever made. Now, I don't mean that as an insult to you, but sheep don't know what they need. They don't know where to go, and left to their own, sheep will usually be devoured by a wolf. That's just the nature of sheep. So you have to have a shepherd if you're a sheep to protect you, to guide you, to help you know what you need and what you want. Now, we have to make a decision, though, and that is, first of all, do we believe truly that God will meet our needs? We say that. We claim that's a belief of ours. We want to believe that. But do you lay at night awake, worrying? Do you wake up in the middle of the night with concerns? Are you spending a lot of time fretting? Because if we're doing that, we're taking the burden of meeting our needs away from our shepherd and placing it on ourselves. So there's two things you have to ask yourself. One is, are you willing to let Jesus be your shepherd? But two, are you willing to be a sheep? Because there are some disadvantages of being a sheep. Because if you're a sheep, you have to follow. If you're a sheep, you have to trust. So I want to just share 3 simple things with you that you need to do if you're going to be a sheep. And I think that Stephen might have stolen my first point, because the first one is listen to Jesus. In John chapter 10, if you want to turn there, in verse 4 and 5, Jesus says this. He says, when he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Here's the thing about sheep that is really interesting, is you can have several flocks come together in a square by accident of sheep. And you might worry, well, they're all going to get mixed up and someone's going to steal my sheep. But if all 3 of those shepherds jumped up at the same time and went in different directions and started calling, guess what? The sheep know the voice of their shepherd. They'll actually follow the correct shepherd. And we have a lot of voices in our minds. Some of them, as Stephen pointed out, are voices on social media. And they're probably not the types of voices that we ought to be listening to. Some of these are the voices of worries and concerns that just go racing through our mind. And those are not the voice as sheep that we ought to be listening to. What we ought to be doing is listening to the voice of God. Rarely do I find someone, sometimes this is the case, rarely do I find someone that is struggling with with finding their needs met in God that is also spending time regularly in the Word. Rarely do I find someone that is worrying that is also spending a lot of time praying. Now I do, but when you're in the Word and you're listening to Jesus and you're praying and talking to Jesus, you face your worries in a different way, don't you? You learn to cast them on the shepherd and let him do the heavy lifting. And so don't be a goat. Do you know what the difference is between sheep and goats? Well, goats don't listen, and they certainly don't follow. Don't be a goat that decides you can do it on your own, but instead be a sheep that follows. Now, the second thing is learn to differentiate between your needs and your wants. Back in John 10 again, in verse 10, Jesus says, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." Satan is very deceptive. He'll tell you what you need. He'll give you a really pretty picture of it. He'll show you a way to get it. If you don't get it and you're upset, he'll tempt you again, even if he won't give it to you. He'll tempt you that he'll give it to you, and sometimes he'll just give it to you. And what happens is we end up thinking we know what we need and we know what we deserve. And you know what we think we deserve as sheep? Well, we deserve to just be in a big field of belly-deep alfalfa grass. That's what we think we deserve. And we think that's what we need. Well, I want you to know that when Jesus talked about sheep, and when the psalmist talks about leading the sheep into green pastures over there in Israel, it's not really the picture that you might have in your head. And so I got a video that I want to share with you that's really good by an archaeologist that goes over and preaches sermons over in Israel, and I think you'll enjoy this.
Because the Psalm 23, "The Lord leads me into green pastures," has been pictured as belly-deep alfalfa. Well, you haven't seen any belly-deep alfalfa. And from biblical time to today, it's rare to see a flock in the farm country. There isn't a lot of farm country in this culture, and so farmers kept the shepherds out as much as they could. Maybe they would come in a little bit after the harvest to glean what was left, but you don't want sheep where you can farm. This is the land of the shepherd. I remember my first impression. I woke up one morning, I was sleeping out in the wilderness, and I remember waking up, watching a flock of sheep on a hillside like this, and my feeling was, what are those, rock-eating sheep? I mean, what do they eat? How can you call this green pastures? Well, the answer is, there's a small amount of moisture present here. They get a little bit of rain every year. Not much, but a little. Second, there is humidity in the air, especially in the evening breeze. Like right now, you can feel it coming from the west off the Mediterranean. There's moisture in the air. That moisture, combination of the rain and the humidity, condenses or drips along the edge of these rocks here. And if you notice, right around the rocks, almost always next to the rocks, you get little tufts of green. Get one a moment. That's what we refer to as the green pastures. So the shepherd looks for a hillside. That's exactly what she was doing. Look at that flock across from us there. Just stunning. Those two shepherd girls have found a hillside that either was exposed to the wind or had that small amount of rain. And they move that flock across the hillside, and it's one mouthful here, walk a step or two, another mouthful, another mouthful, another mouthful.
Now, let's be honest about it. We don't really want to walk across a rocky hill and look for our food. We'd like to plop ourselves down in belly-deep alfalfa and the rest of our life not have to move more than about an inch or two to get what we want. And how many of you have a life that turned out like that? That you just got everything you need around you and you don't have to work and you don't have to learn and you don't have to grow? That's not life. Our life is much more like these sheep that are going across this rocky, hilly terrain, and we're looking for tufts of grass as we go, and we need to let God lead us. Do you remember what happened to Lot? Lot and Abraham talked about where to go, and Lot said, well, I'm going to go down there to those fertile fields because I'm going to have everything I need and I'm going to become wealthy. And he went down there, but God didn't lead him there, and what he found was a place full of sin, and eventually God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah with fire, and he lost his wife, who turned around against the instructions of God, the simple instructions, don't look back, and she became a pillar of salt. Instead, God says, trust me. Don't go the easy route. Don't try and jump into the belly-deep alfalfa field. Walk with me across the hilly terrain and let me teach you. Let me grow you. Let me fill the real needs that you have in your life. And so what we really have to do is understand, one, the difference between needs and wants, but thirdly now, we need to trust God to meet our needs, right? So Jacques Lacan, a French philosopher, said this: never, ever betray your desires. Now, this is our culture. Don't ever give up on your dream. You go for what you want. You deserve it. You're worth it. You're good enough. This is not the message of the culture. The message of Jesus is a countercultural message that says, don't just throw your dream out there and chase it. Interact between your dream and God and let God show you where to go. Let God show you what to love. Let God guide you, teach you, feed you. Trust God to make the decision. So what we have to decide, though, is, do we really want to be sheep? Or would we rather do what our culture encourages us to do and be a goat that does whatever he wants? And so there's some consequences, of course, to those sorts of decisions. In Matthew 7, verses 7 through 11, Jesus says this: ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks the door will be opened. Which of you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you're evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So the question is, do we trust God to give us what we need? Or are we going to say, God, here's what I need. I hope you'll help me get it. And if you don't help me, I'll have to do it on my own. And the reason that we do that is we trust our own instincts about what we need more than we trust God. And God won't bless us if we don't learn to trust God for what we need. In Philippians chapter 4, verses 12 through 13, Paul says this: I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret, he says, of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Here's what he says: I can do that through Christ who gives me strength. You can only live through this fog. You can only find satisfaction on the hilly desert through the strength of Christ and being willing to be a sheep. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, Paul says this: I've been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And the life I now live in the body, and it's a particular type of life, right? And this is the spiritual life. It's the life of Christ. So this life, I now live in the body. I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So we have to learn to let something inside of us die so that Christ can live. And it's a battle because Satan will keep deceiving you and stirring back that self-goat life you have in you. But there's consequences when you try and decide that you're going to live your life as a goat. Because a goat doesn't listen to advice. Recently, there was a real tragedy that happened because of fog. I know you're all going to remember this story. But the fog was so bad in LA that day, the police grounded all of their helicopters. Remember that story? And what happened? Kobe Bryant, his daughter, and several members of that team decided that they were going to be goats and do what they wanted to do. And they got this helicopter pilot, and I don't know whose fault it was, but I know it was really poor judgment, whoever made those decisions. And they flew into the fog, and they did not know where they were going, but they were determined to get what they needed. And at some point in time, they must have thought they were going the right direction because they sped into the ground and they all died. Now, you know, when you're in fog, by the way, this is a cup of water. It tastes pretty good, actually. It's in a Withamsville Church Cross cup, just so you know, a little bit of free promotion here. This is about 8 ounces of water. Now, if you vaporize this into fog, did you know that this would equal 7 city blocks 100 feet deep? It disperses into billions of particles, and if you could take all the water out of the air in a 7 city block area 100 feet deep, you'd get about this much right here. And so I tell you all that. Tell you this, to you it's 7 city blocks of your life, but to God it's just a cup of water. And if you'll trust God, he can shrink it all down for you. But you have to trust God and let your desires and your goat side die so that the Christ side can live in you and learn how to be a sheep. So we need to learn to listen to Jesus. We need to learn to differentiate between our wants and our needs, and we need to trust Jesus to give us the true bread of life, to give us the living waters that lives in us through his Holy Spirit. We need to trust Jesus to be the center of our life, and we need to be willing to be sheep, because David says, "The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want." And what we learn is what we need more than anything else are all things that only Jesus can give us. If you need Jesus and you're here today, we want to help you find him. We want to teach you about him. We want to help you put him on in baptism if you haven't done that before. If you're at home today, I want to encourage you to recommit yourselves to letting Jesus be your shepherd, and you shall not want. Let's stand and sing.